Job chapter 38 and verse 19, we're going to pick up. In verses 1 through 18, the Lord breaks his silence, if you will, and begins to answer pretty much, for the most part, the conversations between Job and his friends, and more in particular to the statements that Job has made. At least that's what's happening here in this chapter, in chapter 38. And what the Lord has done is he's brought Job's attention to this. And really what's happening in chapter 38 is, the Lord expressing to Job that it was his providence that Job has perhaps questioned. And we never fully understand the fullness and the extent of God's work, and especially in our own lives and the life of the church. And the benefit, the privilege that we have is that though we might not know it all, God invites us to be a part of it, and then we fellowship with him in it. And even in the difficult times, it's not just in the good, but even in the suffering. And the Lord is still speaking. Job hasn't responded yet. He won't respond for a while, but the Lord is still speaking, and he's asked Job some questions, because there are some things that Job said with certainty. Later he'll repent of it, but he called attention, and he asked Job some questions. He asked Job, where were you when I created all these things? Since you are certain as to these certain things, or you have a desire to question, or remember, as Job said, if I could just plead my case, then I would tell the Lord this, or tell God this. And in a sense, in verse 4, he kind of lays it out. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? There's just that alone. He's saying, since you know so much about me and my work, explain this to me. And this is what he's been doing. He's been kind of laying these things out. So in verse 19, he says, where is the way of the dwelling of light? And notice he starts off with the foundation of creation. He talks about, God as a builder. And this is kind of the whole thing. Who constructed the earth? Then he also deals with the origin of the ocean, and he kind of gives this picture of like childbirth, and he's saying, where were you when I created all of this? And God controlled the waters in creation. Job, where were you? And then he takes it a step further in verse 12 through 15, and he says, you can't approach the sun. Where were you when I put all this in place? So he's laying down we know the answer to it. Job really has no answer to it. And then he begins to talk about, the ocean floor, the depth of the ocean. And he says, have you been to the bottom of the sea? Well, obviously the answer is no. And then he picks up here in verse 19, where is the way to the dwelling of light? And in other words, he's saying, what are the measurements? Do you know the span of light? Do you know how this kind of operates? Who guides them? And who is guiding this? From the east and the west, and the rising of the sun to its going down. And he says here, and darkness, where is its place, that you may take it to its territory, that you may know the paths to its home. Do you know it because were you born then? Or because the number of your days is great? In other words, are you old enough to know that? Were you born to see that? The answer is no. And Job not being able to answer would really bring him to a place of humility. And this response from the Lord is constant. He's not like asking him, hey, what do you think about this, Job? He's telling him. The Lord knows very well that Job cannot answer these questions, but what this is doing is this causing Job to understand how at times we can be distracted with the trials and think that we kind of have things knelt down. It was a little bit of what we were talking about last week in that the story of Joseph, where not once did he complain about his suffering. And ultimately, the end of the story is what you meant. He told his brothers, what you meant for evil, well, God meant it for good. In a sense, what Joseph was saying was, you thought you got rid of me, but God allowed you to get rid of me. That's a pretty... So, in a sense, there was two things that he did. Number one, he revealed to them that all of this was a part of God's plan. And number two, he kind of relieved them of the guilt, because in all actuality, this all worked out for God's intended purpose. Your guilt can't even take credit for God's providence. Oh man, that's a good word. See, think about that. And this is what he's saying. He says you can't allow yourself to be that. And he's saying, do not question the providence of the Lord. And so he's still kind of on this topic of the providence of God. So where were you? And he says that you may take it to its territory, that you may know the paths to its home. He says, do you know it? And the answer is no. Verse 22, he says, have you entered the treasury of snow? You know, when I read this portion here, the treasury of snow, or have you seen the treasury of hail? You know what song I thought about? That Indescribable. How many of you guys have heard that song? I think it's Chris Tomlin, right? You know, and that's one of my favorite songs. You know, it's like, you know, and when I read this, I thought, like, this is exactly that. You know, who has, the song says, who has called these things into being? Who knows the sum of these things? Nobody does but God. It's God who does this. And so the Lord is saying, God is saying to Job, he says, have you entered the treasury of snow? The storehouse of these elements. I mean, really think about what the Lord is saying here. And oftentimes when we find ourselves kind of in this situation, we think of the vastness of God. That should bring probably the greatest comfort in any trial, because we know that God is bigger than the circumstance and situation, but even more so that God is in control, because in a sense, we should never lose sight. I believe this is what Peter was articulating on the topic of trials, that God specifically designs trials. And you have to be okay with that there's trials that he designs for you. And he's allowing you to experience these things and walk through these things. And in a sense, I don't know what's greater. The trial and the loss that Job experienced, or God saying, so what do you know? I mean, this is God, holy, righteous God. Nothing in the earth of its creation is greater than him. The psalmist in Psalm 104 had the same thought. We're going to look at that here in a bit. But notice what I think is interesting here is he says here, have you entered? Well, it's obvious that this storehouse, this treasury, this ability to be able to do what the snow does in its time, what hail does. You know, hail has a purpose. God's used it in judgment. He's used it to stop work, and he's used it to judge man. And he's saying, do you know how that works? And he says this here. He goes on to say, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, released it when I chose. Do you have that type of control? The treasury of snow. Psalm 33 and verse 7. We were in Psalm 33 and verse, I think, 12 today. But verse 7 also sheds light on kind of what we're seeing here. Psalm 135 and verse 7 as well. And the Lord reserves these things. He did so in Joshua chapter 10, in verse 11. He says, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war. Remember when in Exodus, where the Lord was dealing with, you know, Pharaoh and Egypt, right? And the 10 plagues. And it's interesting because just recently we were on this topic of the Old Testament. I'm not too sure what we were, and I didn't even fully catch it. I was distracted, and I shouldn't have been. I should have been listening, but maybe it'll come to, Brother Albert's mind. We were sitting in this class, and I wasn't paying attention at all. All I know is that I just heard them say something to the nature of the 10 plagues in Egypt, and then in Numbers chapter 14 in verse 22, the Lord's like, and these 10 times you have, resisted me. And it's like they knew they couldn't go beyond 10 because they knew what happened to Egypt after the 10th time. Like they were done. And so it was just this whole picture of, boy, God even has not only discipline, but battle, but war. All these things serve his purpose even when he's correcting us. And is there or could there have been some correcting? Of course, Job repents of what he needed to be corrected of. But he's saying all of this, and maybe the contrast from his trial to creation probably should have gave some consolation to Job in thinking, well, you think of my trial that much? To compare and contrast that you are sovereign over creation, and in the same way, I need to rest assured that you're sovereign over my trial. That, I think, is pretty amazing. When you begin to understand the power of God in creation, then you can truly expect the power of God in your trial. He says here, by what way is light diffused? By what way is light diffused? By what way is it divided? Or the east wind scattered over the earth? Or in other words, where do you know where it's divided? Do you know where the wind blows? Now, obviously Job didn't have the ability to see, and the answer is no, but the Lord is laying down some, I think, good points here to Job. Focus on the vastness of my sovereignty rather than the weight of your trial. Elihu did, in a sense, reference that the Lord would use elements of weather for these types of things in chapter 37 in verses 6 and 7. He says it very clearly, for he says to the snow, fall on the earth, likewise to the gentle rain, the heavy rain of his strength. He seals the hand of every man that all may know his work. And it's kind of going back to that, what is stated in Romans, where, God's active hand in creation really in and of itself will testify against us. Did you know that? Like these things will speak against us. It says in Romans chapter 1 in verse 20, it says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. That's it testifying against that. We can't say, oh, we didn't know. In other words, what is he saying here? Just look at creation. How could you have not known? I mean, that, in a sense is, wow. Lord, you're in everything. Now, listen, I don't want to get off track here and get this weird, type of theology where people say, oh, God is in everything. The God of my understanding. It's not what we're talking about here. But you could look upon creation and see the power of God. And the Lord is really wanting Job to see the sovereignty of God in comparison to the greatness of his trial. And if God is all of this, then he will be all of this in your circumstance. Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water? God. Or a path for the thunderbolt, who's told the thunderbolt where it should go? to cause it to rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness in which there is no man. Like, when you look at, the beauty, I think it was one of the brothers here was telling me, have you been to this part of California? It's the most beautiful thing that you ever seen, and yeah, I've been to some pretty amazing places around the world, and there was no gardener or nobody there to tend to that piece of land. I mean, it's literally the words that come out of your mouth. This is God's creation. This is by God's design. That this is what makes it. So this is what he's saying to him. Job, have you not seen how beautiful places are that you would say, man, who's taking care of this? Well, nobody. Well, yeah, God is. To cause it to rain into land where there is no one. That also is, God's activity. So, it's kind of like this whole idea where it says, God worked 6 days and then he what on the seventh day? Well, he rested. And then some people feel like that's what he did. He just stopped and that's it. It's done. Like I finished. I just hammered the last nail. And then on the seventh day I rested and now I just kick back and I just look at everything. No, God's actively involved in his creation. Even today. And if we follow, basically the Genesis record of the book of Genesis, you find that in this entire picture here, we're about, over 6,000 years old. At least I'm one of those young earth guys, so don't judge. But I believe that. And, I think it's all going to fall in place here pretty soon. I think that at some point, I don't know, maybe right around the 7th. I'm not trying to set a date. I'm not a date setter. I don't know the exact date and time. I just know that it could happen at any time. But I know we still have a literal 1,000-year reign. So then some would say, well, that's going to bring us to 8,000 years after the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Well, the number 8 is new beginnings in the Bible. That's a good view to have. Because it's all going to be made new after the millennial reign, right? And so, but with all of this, God is still actively involved in it. And that's why, like in Romans 1, it gives us that picture there that man cannot stand before God and say, well, I didn't know that you even existed. He goes on to say here that to satisfy the desolate waste and cause to bring forth the growth of tender grass, has the rain a father? Or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb comes the ice and frost of heaven, who gives birth? Well, no man can birth any of this or do any of this or create any of this. And the answer is no man, because there isn't any. This is all God's doing. The waters harden like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen. And these are the things that only God can do. Can you bind the cluster of Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion? Can you bring out Mazzaroth, also known as the 7 stars, or in its season? Or can you guide the great? The term here, the great, is the constellations, and the great bear with its cubs, or Arcturus. He's talking about the constellations, its stars, and then that whole picture there, the Big Dipper. As I was looking at this, and you look this up, and I says, man, Job gazed upon those very same things. They've been there this long. And he's saying, did you put those in place? Did you command those to go where they go? No. Job's not answering. I'm just answering for Job, okay? He says, do you know the ordinances of the heavens? In other words, he's saying, do you know the laws that regulate the heavens? Do you know the laws that regulate the heavenly bodies, the constellations, the Milky Ways, the galaxies, all of this stuff? Now, a lot of this stuff, obviously, Job didn't know. The only heaven that he's seen is the stars that he would look upon at night, but he didn't know anything beyond that. And all he knew is that the sun would rise and it would set. All he knew were the things that he experienced in his own personal life. And in just a matter of a month, it seemed like his entire world, as he knew it, and everything that he believed about God, came to this point where these things were now addressed to him. And God in no way is trying to diminish Job or humiliate him or make him feel horrible. What he's just explaining to him is he's saying, Job, you need to snap out of this. Because in the midst of all of this that's taking place, and this pain and this perhaps confusion, and your buddies are not doing a good job at all whatsoever, but in the midst of all of this, do you understand that the one who created all things is in control? And there's never a point in time when God has lost control. And it's not the picture and the idea that most people want to hear or most people want to really receive or accept at the moment, but the reality is the truth. And the truth is that as much as we would want our suffering to go away, as much as we would want not to experience the hardships or the difficulties, we can get through it because God is completely in control. And we can rest in the sovereignty of the Lord. Then he goes on to say here, can you set their dominion over the earth? Man has no control. He has none. He can't control these things, nor would he ever be able to. Can you lift up your voice to the clouds? Job, can you command the clouds to do some things? That at an abundance of water may cover you? Can you send out lightnings that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the mind? Oh, that's a good one. Or who has given understanding to the heart? This is not by man's design or man's doing, because man is created. And man in his depravity, in his lost state, in his state of thinking to some degree that he's something, can be very distorted in his position, how he stands before the Lord. This is what we see in Romans chapter 1 as it continues on. It says, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him, and as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and foolish in their hearts were darkened. That's like the best man can do. Man can't bring wisdom, and he cannot, bring counsel to the heart, wisdom to the heart. He says, professing to be wise, they become fools. This is the best that man has to offer. Look at what else he goes on to say. And change the glory of the incorruptible God into an image, listen to this, made like corruptible man. You see, man's greatest issue is taking what was created in the image of God and abusing that to its own image. And this is what he's saying here. Birds of four-footed animals, and birds and four-footed animals and creepy things. Verse 24, therefore God has also given them up to uncleanness, and the lust of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Worship the creature rather than the Creator. For that reason, God gave them up to vile passions. This is this whole picture of what does man bring to the table. Well, this is what he brings to the table here. For even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise, also men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do the things which are not fitting. Turning them over to a debased mind. Now think about that for a moment. He's saying, this is man's best. And really, that's what it is. You can read the rest of it. It's what he's saying here. The best that man has to produce is not coming from the Creator. It's coming from creation, because man is created. So given over to himself, he can't produce anything better than that. So who has put wisdom in the mind? Not man. We've seen what man can offer. And who has given understanding to the heart? Not man. Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Or who can pour out the bottles of heaven when the dust hardens in clumps and the clods cling together? And he's saying, Job, can you at some point in any way control the weather? Can you control the atmosphere? Or let's consider these other aspects of creation. He's saying, can you hunt the prey for the lion? Or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lurk in their lars to lie in wait? Who provides food for the raven and when its young one cries to God and wander about for a lack of food? It's kind of like when Jesus is saying in the Gospels, don't worry about anything. Consider the lilies of the field and the sparrows. And he's talking about how, God takes care of all of them, because that is on the area of worry. Turn your worries over to the Lord, because God is in control. And if God takes care of even the sparrow, really think about it. But in the context of Job 38, he's saying to him, listen, you can't do any of this, Job. God has all things in control. It's according to his plan, according to his purpose. The Bible says in Psalm 104, it says this, bless the Lord, O my soul, O Lord my God, you are very great. You guys remember that hymn? It's one of my favorite ones. This is my Father's world. Anybody ever heard that hymn? Boy, that's one of my all-time favorites. I love that song. And they believe that this kind of inspired that hymn, This is my Father's world. And the writer of the song was at Niagara Falls and was there watching the creation of Niagara Falls and contemplating in his mind and in his heart the psalmist here. And this is what he was saying. This is my Father's world. This is my Father's world. This is all God's doing. And some believe here the elements of Psalm 104 is Genesis 1. Perhaps creation is in view. And the writer had Genesis 1 in mind. It's believed to be a psalm of David. And he says, praise to the sovereign Lord, the rulership, the one who rules, the Lord, for his creation and his providence. Notice that term there, providence. God's protective care as he timely prepares action for future events. God is working ahead. He's providentially working. He says, bless the Lord. He's calling them to praise in worship to God. And he's saying, this is who he is, clothed in honor and majesty. God's creation is great, but the Creator is by far greater. Who covers yourself with light? It's kind of, to be clothed with light is to be characterized by it, right? 1 John chapter 1 and verses 5 and 7. But look at this whole picture here as he's saying this. Who covers yourself with light and as with a garment, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 22, like a tent. He lays the beams of the upper chambers in the waters. These upper rooms of seclusion. Meaning he's above it all. He's above his creation. Who makes the clouds his chariot, who walks on the wings of the wind. These were the questions he asked Job. He says, were you here? Can you do this? Well, who's in view here? The Lord God. Who makes his angels spirits, his ministers a flame of fire. Arrays them. these servants of the Lord. You see the picture here in verses 2 and 4. If you look at Genesis chapter 1 and look at verses 6 through 8, you kind of have this picture here of the first 4 verses of Psalm 104. You who laid the foundations, and this is what we've seen in chapter 38 and verse 4, of the earth, so that it should not be moved forever. Only the Lord sets things that cannot be moved. You look at verses 5 through 9 here in Psalm 140. You're taking Genesis chapter 1 and verses 9 and 10. He says, you covered the deep as with a garment. The water stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. And the voice of your thunder has hastened away. So in other words, at his command, the sea, the springs, and the rivers, all those things came into being. They went up over the mountains and they went down into the valleys to the place where you found it for them. You have set a boundary. Kind of like what we just read there in chapter 38 and verses 9 and 10 of Job. Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 22. You have set a boundary that they may not pass over you. All creation is in God's control and give an account to the Lord, that they may not return to cover the earth. That's at God's command. He sends the springs into the valleys. They flow among the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkey quenched their thirst. What is he saying? Can you take care of the beast? I water those fields where no man is even there. It's like that one saying that they say, hey, if a tree falls in the forest, would you hear it? Nobody's there. And if you're not there, obviously you're not. But what's the picture? Of course. It's as if to say, if God's like there's nobody there. No, God is everywhere. He's omnipresent. To pass over that they may not return to cover the earth. I love this whole thing. He says, by the birds of the heavens, they have their home. They sing among the branches, the waters, the hills from its upper chambers. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your works. Notice the psalmist is praising God, and it's like you take the psalmist and you take Job, and these two should have sat together and had a conversation. Everything that God is asking Job, the psalmist here is just saying, oh, this is God. He causes the grass to grow, the cattle, the vegetation for the service of man, that he may bring forth food from earth, the wine that makes glad the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and beard, beards are biblical, which strengthens man's heart. They're part of creation. Thank you, Lord, for creating this. He said, it's going to cost you. Really? Yeah, it's going to cost you the rest of your hair, but I'll give it to you. The trees of the Lord are full of sap, the cedars of Lebanon, which he planted. These cedars of Lebanon, massive. God planted those. Where the birds make their nests, the stork has her home in the fir trees. The high hills are for the wild goats. The clefts are a refuge for the rock badgers. Pastor Simon's mascot. He appointed the moon for seasons. The sun knows it's going down. Remember, he asked him, can you measure that, Job? The psalmist is saying, hey, the sun's controlled by God. It goes down, it comes up. You make darkness and it's night. In listen to this, in which all the beasts of the forest creep about. Young lions roar at their prey. Who does that? Who sets up their prey? God does. You guys feel sorry for that little prey. That's all God's doing right there. It's part of the food chain. And seek their food from God. Man, if animals know how to seek their food from God, shouldn't we? When the sun rises, they gather together and lie down in their dens. Man goes out to work and his labor until the evening. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions. This great and wide sea in which are innumerable teeming things, living things, both small and great. There the ships sail about. there is that Leviathan. And we're going to read about him in a couple of chapters here in Job, which you have made to play there. This large sea creature, unknown in its identity. So many interpretations, but we'll get to that when we get there. Always ask, is it a dinosaur? What do you think it is, Pastor? We'll get there. These all wait for you that you may give their food in due seasons. What you give them, they gather in. You open your hand, they are filled with good. You hide your face, they are troubled. You take away their breath, they die and return to the dust. You send forth your spirit, they are created. You renew their face of the earth. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. He looks on the earth and it trembles. He touches the hills, they smoke. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being. Notice that, while I have my being. He's not talking about the circumstance or situation. He's saying, as long as I have breath in my lungs. My meditation be sweet to him. I will be glad in the Lord. May sinners be consumed from the earth and the wicked be no more. Bless the Lord, O my soul. I wish Job could have heard that. This probably should have been the counsel that his friends gave him, but they didn't. But I believe that the Lord in some way is bringing him to this conclusion and understanding that the psalmist is. Why? Because it's not like the Lord is asking Job something he doesn't know the answers to already. Job, I believe, knows the answers, but Job needs to understand that he took his trial a little bit more serious than God's sovereignty. And though trials do stretch us and pull us in every which different direction, I don't know what it is to experience what Job experienced, but here's what I do know. The Lord is in control, even in the midst of greatest pain. And all of this is not to humiliate Job and make him look bad. It's to draw attention to the one who is able to carry him through. And then Job then repents, apologizes to the Lord for even thinking otherwise. And so the psalmist actually answers for Job the way Job should have spoke to his friends. And the Lord is saying, listen, if you think Job chapter 38 is far, like some people would read this and say, how could Job have known this? The psalmist did. Why? Because God reveals himself to his people. But when you elevate your circumstance greater than God, you won't know the Lord this way. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. And if he's the sovereign God over his creation, let him be the sovereign God over your trial.